Before we begin, a mandatory disclaimer for our audience. The following story is a work of fiction for entertainment purposes. Although set within a real historical context, the characters and dialogues are fictional and do not represent factual or documentary accounts. Have you ever loved something so much that you became blind to its cracks? Have you ever pinned the entire pride of a nation, the very identity of an empire, onto 48,000 tons of steel and hope? Before there was the terror of the Bismarck or the colossal shadow of the Yamato, there was the Hood. To the world, she was the mighty Hood, the largest, fastest, and most beautiful warship to ever fly the white ensign. For 20 years, she was the golden boy of the British Empire, a floating palace of diplomacy that traveled the globe, showing the world that Britannia still ruled the waves. But I remember the truth beneath the polish. I remember the secret whispers in the engine rooms and the nervous glances of the architects. We loved her, God knows we did, but the Hood was a masterpiece built for a world that had already vanished. How does the ultimate symbol of British power turn into a pillar of fire in less than 8 minutes? I was a young signalman on the North Atlantic run, and I can still see her silhouette cutting through the mist of the Denmark Strait, elegant, tall, and utterly doomed. My name is lost to time now, but in the spring of 1941, I was part of a generation that grew up in the shadow of the Hood. To us, she wasn't just a battlecruiser, she was a promise. She was the ship that could go anywhere and face anything. The fascination we felt for her was a kind of romantic obsession. She had those long, sweeping lines and a quarterdeck that seemed to stretch on forever. When she sailed into a harbor, the world stopped to watch. But as a sailor, you learned to listen to the ship, and the Hood was tired. She had been built during the Great War, designed before we truly understood the danger of shells plunging from high altitudes. She was a battlecruiser, all the speed and teeth of a lion, but with the skin of something much thinner. We called it the secret Flaw. Her deck armor was her Achilles heel, a thin layer of steel standing between the magazine and the wrath of a modern enemy. We knew it, the Admiralty knew it, but we believed the myth of the Hood was enough to keep the shells away. I remember the atmosphere in Scapa Flow just before the final hunt began. The air was cold, tasting of salt and impending rain. The news had reached us. The Bismarck had broken out. The nightmare was real. The fascination with the Hood suddenly turned into a heavy, suffocating pressure. She was the only ship fast enough and powerful enough to intercept the German giant. I saw the men boarding her, nearly 1,500 of them, the best the Royal Navy had to offer. There was a grim sense of duty, but also a hidden, shivering fear. We were sending our aging queen to fight a young, brutal king. The Hood was 20 years old. The Bismarck was brand new, forged in the fires of a Nazi ideology that didn't care about the gentleman's rules of the sea. Standing on the jetty, watching the Hood weigh anchor for the last time, I felt a strange premonition. The sun was hitting her brasswork, making her glow one last time before she disappeared into the gray maw of the North Atlantic. The psychological weight of being the pride of the Navy is a terrible thing to carry into battle. Every man on the Hood knew that if they failed, the heart of England would break. They weren't just fighting for a trade route or a strategic point. They were fighting to prove that the old world still had strength. The fascination with her elegance was our shield, but the North Atlantic doesn't care about elegance. It only cares about thickness of plate and caliber of gun. As the Hood steamed toward the Denmark Strait alongside the brand new Prince of Wales, she looked magnificent, a silver streak against the charcoal waves. But beneath that beauty lay the flaw we all prayed would never be found. We were chasing a monster, and we were sending our most beloved treasure to lead the charge. The stage was set for the most shocking 6 minutes in naval history, and the ghost of the Hood was already beginning to call out to the depths. The trek toward the Denmark Strait felt like a journey to the edge of the world. As we steamed north, the air grew so cold it seemed to crystallize in your lungs, and the spray from the swells turned into jagged ice the moment it touched the Hood's gray steel. I remember the sound of the hull smashing through the whitecaps, a rhythmic, punishing boom that felt like a heartbeat. The fascination we had for the ship's speed was now being put to a brutal, practical test. The Hood was pushing 30 knots, her longbow slicing through the water, desperate to close the gap before the Bismarck could disappear into the fog and shadows of the open Atlantic. We were the shield of the Empire. But up there, in the gray-green wasteland between Iceland and Greenland, the Empire felt very far away. There was only the wind, the sea, and the growing realization that we were racing toward a collision that would define the war. The psychological weight on the crew during those final 48 hours was suffocating. On most ships, you have the camaraderie of the mess deck, the jokes, the games of cards. But on the Hood, a strange, heavy dignity had taken over. The men knew the stakes. They knew that the Bismarck wasn't just another ship. It was a hunter designed to kill exactly what they represented. I saw the gunners polishing the massive 15-inch barrels of the main turrets, their movements mechanical and somber. There was a fascination with our own power, yes. We still had 8 of the most famous guns in history. But there was also the secret Flaw whispering in the back of everyone's mind. Every time a wave crashed over the deck, I thought about the thinness of that steel. We were a battlecruiser built for a different age, a glass cannon that had to hit first or risk everything. The tension wasn't a sharp scream. It was a low, constant hum that made your hands shake when you tried to light a cigarette. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, leading the charge from the Hood's bridge, was a man under an immense burden. He knew his ship was vulnerable to plunging fire, shells that came from high angles and crashed through the thin deck armor into the magazines. To counter this, his strategy was simple but terrifying. Close the range as fast as possible. He wanted to get so close that the German shells would hit the thick side armor instead of the weak roof. It was a gambler's move. The fascination with the Hood's speed was now a desperate tactical necessity. We were charging a giant, hoping our legs were fast enough to get us inside his reach before he could swing his club. Every nautical mile we covered felt like a step closer to a trap, the radar flickering with ghosts and false echoes as the mist settled around us like a shroud. I remember the last night, the sun barely dipping below the horizon in those high latitudes, leaving a haunting, eternal twilight. The ship felt alive, a vibrant organism of oil and steam. But it also felt like a funeral procession. We were dressed in our anti-flash gear, white hoods and gloves designed to protect us from the fire of a hit. Seeing 1,500 men dressed in white, looking like ghosts before they were even dead, was a sight I'll never forget. The fascination of war, the glory we had all been promised in the recruitment posters, had been replaced by a cold, clinical preparation for catastrophe. We were the mighty Hood, the pride of 1,000 years of seafaring history, but as the lookouts strained their eyes through the freezing drizzle, we realized we were just flesh and blood standing on a thin sheet of metal, waiting for a monster to emerge from the white. Then, the signal came through. Visual contact. The Prince of Wales had spotted them. The Bismarck and the Prince Eugen were there, 2 dark silhouettes cutting through the ice-choked water. My heart didn't race. It stopped. The fascination was over. The hunt was done. We turned our bows toward the enemy, the Hood leading the way, her great engines roaring for the last time. We were entering the kill zone, and the secret Flaw was about to meet the most modern fire control system in the world. The dawn of May 24th was breaking, a cold gray light that offered no warmth, only enough clarity to see exactly who was about to kill us. At 05:35 a.m., the world was a study in shades of gray and iron. The Denmark Strait was a cold, unforgiving theater, and as the Hood surged forward at 28 knots, the spray from her bow was a frozen mist that coated the optics of our rangefinders. The fascination of the previous 20 years, the parades, the royal visits, the status of being the world's most famous ship, evaporated in the heat of a single command. Open fire. I remember the first salvo from the Hood's forward guns. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical blow that shook the very foundations of the ship, a roar that announced Britain had finally found its enemy. But as the orange flashes lit up the morning gloom, a terrifying realization swept through the bridge. Through a trick of the light and the angle of approach, we were firing at the wrong ship. We were targeting the Prinz Eugen, while the Bismarck, the real monster, sat silently in the mist, calculating our doom with mechanical precision. The psychological weight of those first 3 minutes was unbearable. We were closing the range, charging headlong into the path of the German shells, just as Admiral Holland had planned, but the Bismarck remained eerily quiet. Then, the giant spoke. The first German salvo didn't hit us, but it was close, terrifyingly close. The plumes of water that rose around the hood were as tall as our masts, a clear sign that their fire control was already locked onto our silhouette. The fascination we felt for German engineering was suddenly a visceral, life-threatening reality. They weren't just firing, they were bracketing us. On the bridge, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the frantic chanting of the gunnery officers. We shifted our fire to the Bismarck, our 15-inch shells screaming across the water. But the Hood was an old boxer trying to land a punch on a younger, faster opponent. We were fighting for our lives, and every second we spent on that long-range approach was a second the secret Flaw was exposed to the sky. Then came the first hit. It wasn't the fatal blow, but it was the beginning of the end. A shell from the Prinz Eugen struck the Hood's boat deck near the mainmast. In an instant, a massive fire erupted. It wasn't just a small blaze, it was a hungry, roaring inferno fueled by the ready-use ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns. I remember seeing the flames leaping into the gray sky, a bright, defiant red against the dull colors of the Arctic. The fascination of watching our beautiful ship burn was a sickening thing. Men were rushing with hoses, their white anti-flash gear turning black with soot, but the fire was a signal fire for the Bismarck. It gave them a perfect point of aim. We were a burning torch in the middle of a cold, dark sea, and the German gunners didn't miss. The tension on the Prince of Wales, steaming just behind us, was palpable. They watched as the Hood continued to turn, trying to bring her aft turrets into play, the very move that would expose the weakest part of her deck armor to the plunging shells of the Bismarck. It was a dance of death. I remember the sound of the wind whistling through the rigging and the rhythmic thumping of our own engines, a heartbeat that was about to stop. We were 4 minutes into the engagement. The range was closing, but not fast enough. The fascination with Admiral Holland's dash was being proven right in the most tragic way possible. We had stayed in the danger zone for one salvo too many. At 05:59 a.m., the Bismarck fired its 5th salvo. 4 massive 15-inch shells arched high into the atmosphere, crossing the 5-mile gap in a matter of seconds. We watched them through the spotting glasses, 4 tiny black dots growing larger and larger. There was no time to pray, no time to scream. The secret Flaw was no longer a theory discussed in quiet rooms at the Admiralty. It was an invitation to disaster. One of those shells found its mark. It didn't hit the side armor. It crashed through the thin, unprotected deck near the mainmast, plunging straight into the heart of the ship, the after magazines, where over 100 tons of cordite were stored. For a heartbeat, the Hood stayed together, a silent, majestic ship in the middle of a cold sea. And then, the world ended. The explosion of the HMS Hood was not a sound. It was an erasure of existence. At precisely 06 a.m., as the Bismarck's 5th salvo found its mark, the secret Flaw finally claimed its debt. For those of us watching from the nearby ships, time didn't just slow down, it curdled. I remember a flash of light so intense it made the morning sun look like a dying candle. A colossal pillar of fire, orange and terrifyingly bright, erupted from the center of the ship, near the mainmast. It wasn't a flicker. It was a vertical volcano that reached hundreds of feet into the gray sky, carrying with it pieces of the deck, the lifeboats, and the dreams of a nation. The fascination we had for the Hood's majesty was replaced by a visceral, bone-shaking horror. In that heartbeat, the pride of the British Empire wasn't just hit, it was being torn apart from the inside out. The psychological weight of that moment is impossible to put into words. You have to understand. To a British sailor, the Hood was immortal. Seeing her explode was like watching the ground beneath your feet turn into liquid. The explosion was so powerful that it snapped the back of the ship like a dry twig. The bow and the stern were separated by a wall of flame that seemed to consume the oxygen for miles around. I remember the silence that followed the initial roar, a pressurized, deafening quiet as the shockwave passed over us. On the Prince of Wales, men stood frozen at their stations, their eyes wide and glassy, unable to comprehend that the mighty Hood had just been reduced to a scorched skeleton in the blink of an eye. The secret Flaw had allowed a single shell to penetrate the thin deck armor and reach the 15-inch magazines, turning a masterpiece of engineering into a massive steel-cased bomb. The descent of the ship was hauntingly rapid. As the smoke cleared slightly, the bow of the Hood rose out of the water, pointing toward the sky like a giant accusatory finger. It was a sight of tragic, jagged beauty. The fascination of the architects with her long, graceful lines was now a grotesque caricature as the forward turrets, those massive guns that had never truly found their mark, slid into the depths. And then, something happened that still makes my hair stand on end. As the bow was sinking, as the water was rushing into the shattered hull, the forward guns fired one last time. It was a final, defiant reflex, a mechanical scream from a dying Titan. Even as the sea swallowed her, the Hood was still fighting, her crew perhaps still at their posts, trapped in a nightmare they never saw coming. The disappearance of the ship was so fast it felt like a conjuring trick. From the moment of the explosion to the moment the last piece of steel vanished beneath the whitecaps, only about 3 minutes had passed. 1,500 men had been there. Now, there was only a vast, boiling patch of oil and debris on the surface of the Denmark Strait. The Bismarck and the Prince Eugen continued to fire, their shells now falling around the Prince of Wales. But for us, the world had gone cold. The fascination with the big guns and the great hunt was gone, replaced by a hollow, sickening grief. We had watched our champion die in a way that felt like a betrayal. The Hood was supposed to be the shield, but the shield had shattered on the first real blow. As the Prince of Wales was forced to turn away, trailing smoke and blood, I looked back at the spot where the Hood had been. There was nothing left but a few floating lockers and a dark, spreading stain on the water. The psychological impact on the Royal Navy, and on the world, was a tectonic shift. The myth of British naval invincibility had gone down with that ship. We were no longer the undisputed masters of the ocean. We were a wounded empire chasing a monster that had just proven it could kill us with ease. The secret Flaw had been a death sentence, signed 20 years ago and carried out in 6 minutes of fire. Now, as the Bismarck disappeared back into the mist, the hunt wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about revenge. It was about making sure that the ghost of the Hood didn't cry out in vain from the bottom of that freezing strait. The moments following the Hood's disappearance were filled with a silence more terrifying than the thunder of the guns. The Bismarck had turned its fury toward the Prince of Wales, and as the remaining British ship retreated under a smokescreen, the destroyer, HMS Electra, was ordered back to the site of the explosion. I remember the look on the faces of the rescue crews. They were prepared to pull hundreds, maybe 1,000 men from the water. They had the blankets ready, the hot cocoa, the medical kits. But as they reached the oil-slicked coordinates where the mighty Hood had once ruled, they found a wasteland. The fascination with the ship's size and grandeur was replaced by the horrific reality of its absence. There were no lifeboats, no clusters of cheering sailors. There was only a vast black field of fuel oil, scattered bits of cork insulation, and a single, hauntingly empty officer's cap bobbing on the waves. Out of the 1,418 men who had woken up on the Hood that morning, only 3 were found alive. 3. Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas. They were tiny, oil-covered specks clinging to small rafts in a freezing, indifferent sea. The psychological weight of those numbers is staggering. To lose a ship is one thing. To lose almost an entire generation of specialists, officers, and boys in a single heartbeat is a wound that never truly heals. I remember the reports coming in. 3 survivors. We couldn't believe it. We searched for hours, our eyes straining against the glare of the Arctic sun, hoping for a miracle that never came. The secret Flaw hadn't just sunk a ship. It had acted as a guillotine. The explosion had been so sudden and so total that most of the crew likely never knew the ship had been hit. They were simply there, and then they were gone, swallowed by the pressure and the fire. When the news reached London, it was as if the pulse of the Empire had stopped. The fascination the British public had for the Hood made the announcement feel like a death in the family. I remember the BBC announcer's voice. It was shaky, devoid of the usual wartime bravado. The Admiralty regrets to announce that HMS Hood has been sunk. People stopped in the streets, women cried in the markets. The Hood was the pride of the Navy, the ship that had carried the flag to every corner of the earth. If the Hood could be destroyed in minutes, what did that mean for the rest of us? What did it mean for the boys on the convoys or the families huddling in the bomb shelters? The sinking wasn't just a naval loss. It was a psychological catastrophe that threatened to break the British will to fight. The fascination with the Bismarck now turned into a white-hot national obsession for vengeance. Winston Churchill's order was simple, echoing through every radio set and signal lamp in the fleet: sink the Bismarck. The loss of the Hood had changed the rules of the game. It was no longer about protecting trade routes, it was a blood feud. We were a navy in mourning, but we were also a navy possessed. Every ship that could move, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, was diverted. We didn't care about the cost anymore. The Hood had been the sacrificial lamb, and her death had unleashed a fury that the German High Command had never anticipated. The ghost of the mighty Hood was now the wind in our sails, driving us toward a final confrontation that would either redeem our pride or seal our doom. Standing on the deck of my own ship, looking toward the horizon where the Bismarck had vanished, I felt a cold, hard clarity. The era of romantic naval tradition, of beautiful ships and gentlemanly duels, had died with the Hood. The secret Flaw had shown us that beauty was no shield against modern science. We were moving into a darker, more industrial kind of war, where ships were just expendable tools and men were just fuel for the fire. But as we steamed south following the oil trail of the monster, we carried those 1,415 lost souls with us. The Hood was gone, but her name was whispered in every engine room and on every bridge. The hunt was no longer just a mission. It was a crusade to prove that even if the pride of the fleet could fall, the spirit that built her could never be extinguished. The hunt for the Bismarck ended 3 days later in a storm of steel and retribution. But for those of us who lived through that era, the war never truly felt won until we reconciled with the loss of the Hood. The fascination with her beauty didn't fade with her sinking. It grew into a haunting legend. For 60 years, the mighty Hood lay in the darkness of the Denmark Strait, a secret tomb nearly 3 kilometers down, hidden by the very silt and ice that had witnessed her end. When a team finally discovered the wreck in 2001, the images they sent back were a punch to the gut. The ship wasn't a majestic hull anymore. She was a field of debris, a testament to the absolute violence of the explosion that had claimed her. But there, amidst the rusted steel, they found her bell, the heart of the ship, still shining with a faint ghostly light. The secret flaw of the Hood, the vulnerability that had been whispered about in the shipyards of the 1920s, was confirmed by the wreck. She had been a victim of time, a transitional design caught between 2 worlds. But her legacy isn't one of failure. The psychological weight of her loss forced the Royal Navy to evolve, to abandon the romanticism of the past and embrace the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. The Hood was the last of the great ships built for prestige, and her death marked the true end of the 19th century naval tradition. She was a martyr for a nation that had forgotten that even the most beautiful shield can break. Today, her bell stands in the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth, a silent bronze witness to the 1,415 men who never came home. I often think about those 3 survivors, Briggs, Tilburn, and Dundas. They carried the weight of their lost brothers for the rest of their lives. Ted Briggs, the last of them, lived long enough to see the wreck of his ship on a television screen, a final closure to a nightmare that had started in 1941. The fascination with the Hood continues because she represents something we've lost, a sense of national unity and a belief in symbols that are larger than ourselves. She was more than a weapon. She was the mighty Hood, a floating piece of Britain that was loved by millions who had never even seen the sea. When she died, a part of the British soul died with her, but in its place grew a resilience that would eventually carry the world through the darkness of the war. The Denmark Strait is quiet now. The ice still flows and the mist still clings to the waves, but the ghosts of the Hood and the Bismarck have finally found their peace. The ocean doesn't remember the names of empires or the caliber of guns. It only remembers the weight of the metal and the souls it holds. The story of the HMS Hood is a reminder that no matter how much pride we build into our machines, they are still fragile things in the face of history and the relentless sea. She was the pride of the Navy, and though she fell in a pillar of fire, she remains an eternal sentinel in the deep, reminding us of the cost of glory and the enduring spirit of those who sail into the unknown. If the tragic saga of the HMS Hood and her final stand against the Bismarck has touched you, or if you believe that the memory of these 1,415 men deserves to be preserved, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten stories back to the surface. Comment below. Do you think the Hood was a victim of bad luck or a doomed design from the start? What other ghosts of the sea would you like us to explore next? Thank you for walking these decks with us today. Until we meet again on the next horizon, keep the memory of the Titans alive.